The night Preston Walsh canceled every bonus, the cold pizza was still sitting in cardboard boxes on the break room table. People had been laughing 5 minutes earlier. The kind of exhausted, relieved laughter you hear when a team has carried something impossibly heavy for months and finally sets it down. We had not just hit our Q3 target, we had shattered it. 285% over forecast, $6 million in verified operational savings. The Ford Motor Company had signed a contract that nobody on that floor ever expected to see. So when the door opened and Preston walked in with his polished shoes and that borrowed smile, the room naturally turned toward him. He was the senior vice president. He was the man his uncle had sent to lead the company through its next chapter. If anyone was going to say the words this team had earned, people assumed it would be him. He clapped once and said we had proven what we were truly capable of. He said our record-breaking performance would now become the new baseline. He said bonuses for Q3 were canceled. Then he walked back out. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Sarah from marketing stared at the floor like she was waiting for a correction that was not coming. Calvin from finance very slowly closed his laptop. Nicole, my operations manager, sat perfectly still across the table, and I watched her jaw tighten once before she controlled it. These were people who had given everything to that quarter. Nights away from their families, weekend calls, production emergencies handled before sunrise. They had believed reasonably that the company would see what they had done and acknowledge it. Preston had just told them their reward was a higher mountain. I set my paper cup down on the table. The coffee had already gone cold, and something inside me went very quiet. Not the quiet of someone who has given up, the other kind. The kind that comes when you have been patient for a long time, and the moment you have been waiting for has finally arrived, and you understand clearly that what you do next cannot be undone. I stood, picked up the folder that had been sitting on the chair beside me for 2 weeks, and walked toward the conference room. I stopped in the doorway and looked back at Preston. "Conference room," I said. 5 minutes. Bring your laptop." He looked up from his phone with the expression of a man who expected inconvenience and was prepared to be brief about it. I did not wait for his answer. I walked in and sat down. He had no idea what was in the folder. He had no idea the trap had been waiting for him since 2014. My name is Wesley Harper. I am 48 years old. I spent 14 years building the operations division of a mid-sized manufacturing company in Ohio, from something functional into something genuinely exceptional. Before that, I spent 6 years in the United States Navy, where I learned that competence is not something you announce. It is something you demonstrate repeatedly until people stop doubting it, and then you demonstrate it again. I am not a dramatic person. I do not make speeches. I do not tell people how good I am at my job. I let the floor speak for itself. So when Preston Walsh arrived 6 months before that Q3 meeting and started dismantling the systems I had spent over a decade building, I did not confront him. I did not go over his head. I did not send a tense email that HR would flag and archive. I watched, I documented, and I waited. Because I had read my original employment contract more carefully than Preston had read anything in his life. Preston arrived in March. His uncle, Howard Walsh, had founded the company in 1998. Howard had built it from 12 employees in a rented industrial space into a 500-person operation across 3 facilities. He was not a perfect man, but he was an honest one, and he had given real authority to people who had earned it. I respected Howard. More than that, I trusted him, which in 14 years of manufacturing operations is not something I say carelessly. Howard's health had been declining for about a year. Nothing sudden, but persistent enough that he had made the decision to step back from daily operations. He announced in late February that his nephew Preston would be joining senior leadership to observe, learn the business, and gradually take on more responsibility. That was the official language. Preston's interpretation was different. He walked into the building on a Monday morning and behaved like the acquisition had already closed. 28 years old, Harvard Business School. A suit too expensive for a manufacturing environment, and a confidence too large for a man who had never solved a production problem before breakfast. The first thing he said to me was not hello. It was not good to meet you. It was a comment about spreadsheet software, delivered with the practiced ease of someone who had learned that condescension reads as intelligence if you say it quickly enough. I smiled and told him I had found Excel reliable for 14 years. He laughed, which told me everything I needed to know about how this was going to go. Preston did not waste time. By the end of his first week, my calendar had been reconstructed around a series of meetings with names that sounded meaningful from a distance, but dissolved into noise the moment anyone asked what they were supposed to accomplish.
Innovation culture, reset. Manufacturing synergy alignment, cross-functional, excellence discovery sessions.
Nobody talked about defect rates. Nobody talked about supplier lead times, or machine downtime, or delivery window compliance. The actual language of the floor, the specific and unglamorous vocabulary of keeping a manufacturing operation running, had been replaced with a kind of energetic vagueness that sounded like a TED Talk, written by a committee with no deadline. Then he started moving people.
Nicole Reed had been my operations manager for 8 years. She knew the floor better than most people know their own homes. She could read a production report at 7 in the morning, identify 2 anomalies before the shift briefing, and have corrective action in place before the first break. She was, without question, the most operationally capable person in the building.
Preston transitioned her into a consulting role. That was the phrase he used. Transitioned. As though taking Nicole off the floor and putting her in a corner office with no direct reports and no real work was a form of professional development rather than a deliberate removal. 2 days later, Bryce Miller from Data Analytics was reassigned to something called a Talent Optimization Initiative. Bryce had built our reporting systems from scratch. He could connect a production anomaly on Thursday to a supplier quality issue the previous Tuesday faster than anyone I had worked with. The Talent Optimization Initiative had nothing to do with data, optimization, or talent. In their places, Preston brought in consultants, young, polished, expensive, and almost entirely useless in a manufacturing context. They spoke fluently about strategic pivots and human-centered operational frameworks and the emotional brand identity of the assembly line. When asked direct questions about production throughput or quality control methodology, they redirected to what they called the bigger picture. The bigger picture, as far as I could tell, was a series of slides. I watched all of this happen, and I held every reaction I felt behind a calm face and a cooperative posture. Because I had learned something a long time ago about people who confuse authority with competence. They make mistakes. They overreach. They take shortcuts they do not understand and produce results they cannot explain. And when the system they have been handed finally shows the damage, the only question is whether you have positioned yourself on the right side of the evidence. I had positioned myself very carefully. There was something else I needed to tell you about. Something Preston nearly stole entirely. The Ford opportunity landed on my desk in early April. Precision parts supplier for a new electric vehicle production line. The kind of contract that changes a company's trajectory for a decade. Ford's engineers were methodical, demanding, and allergic to salesmanship. They wanted to see capacity modeling, quality certification timelines, supplier reliability data, and honest projections about production ramp-up. They wanted to understand in specific and verifiable terms whether we could perform at the volume and consistency they required. I spent 2 months building the proposal. Nights, weekends, early mornings in the quiet building before the floor opened and the noise started. I mapped every relevant data point in our operational history. I built risk models. I cross-referenced our supplier relationships against Ford's delivery requirements and identified 3 points of potential friction along with documented mitigation plans for each one. Then Preston decided he should lead the presentation. I handed him simplified talking points. I walked him through the technical framework 3 times. I flagged the questions Ford's engineers were most likely to ask and outlined honest answers for each one. I did everything I could to prepare him because the alternative was watching the largest contract opportunity in company history collapse in a conference room in Dearborn. The morning of the presentation, Preston asked if we could make the slides more dynamic and increase the size of the company logo. That was Preston. In the room, he was exactly what I had been afraid he would be. Expansive, buzzword-heavy, visually confident, and technically empty. He talked about agility-first manufacturing verticals and cross-functional production ecosystems, while Ford's engineers looked at each other across the table with the controlled expressions of people who have sat through this before and are deciding how much of their afternoon to sacrifice to it. What saved us was the data I had built, the defect rates, the delivery record, the capacity models, the 5 years of documented quality performance. The engineers stopped listening to Preston about halfway through and started reading the appendix I had prepared. They asked me 3 direct questions. I answered all 3 without looking at the slides. Ford signed the contract. The next morning, Preston sent a company-wide email with the subject line Victory Lap. He described the contract as the result of his strategic automotive pivot and his innovative client acquisition methodology. He used the phrase transformational leadership twice. He did not mention my name. Not once. I printed the email. I folded it neatly and put it in the drawer of my desk, right behind my original employment contract. I want to explain the contract clause because it matters and because the logic of it tells you something about Howard Walsh that most people never understood. In 2014, the company had a problem. 2 senior operations people had left within the same 12-month window, both recruited away by competitors who offered bigger titles and cleaner politics. Howard was concerned. He was not a man who responded to problems with gestures, so he did not simply offer counter salaries or vague promises about the future. He had legal draft-specific retention language into the employment agreements of his remaining senior operations leadership. My agreement, updated in October of 2014, contained a clause in the appendix. Subsection C, footnote 2. I had read it so many times over the years that I could recite it without looking. The clause stated that if quarterly production efficiency under my direct operational leadership ever exceeded 250% of forecast, I would be granted immediate strategic override privileges pending board ratification. Override privileges meant direct authority over personnel decisions, budget allocation, and operational strategy, bypassing the standard approval chain. At the time the clause was written, 250% was a theoretical number, something Howard had invented to signal seriousness without expecting it to actually be triggered. Legal treated it as a formality. I treated it as a number to keep in the back of my mind. Q3 had closed at 285.3%. When I had first seen the preliminary numbers 3 weeks before Preston's bonus announcement, I had sat with them for a full hour before calling anyone. I went to Calvin's verified report. I checked the methodology. I reviewed the raw data twice. Then I called Jessica Collins in legal. Jessica was one of the few people in the legal department Preston had not yet replaced or shuffled into irrelevance. She was precise, careful, and had been with the company long enough to understand what the contract language meant. I read her the clause. I sent over the scanned agreement, the Q3 report, and the efficiency calculations. She was quiet for almost a full minute. Then she said, "Wesley, do you understand what this means?" I told her I thought I did. She said no. She meant legally. If the numbers were verified, the clause was enforceable. It had never been challenged because it had never been triggered, but the language was clean and the threshold had been crossed in a way that could not be reasonably disputed. My second call went to Martin Hale, our former compliance director, now semi-retired in Montana. He remembered the clause immediately. He remembered the meeting where Howard had insisted on it. He told me Howard had said at the time that he wanted the people who actually ran the company to have a mechanism to protect themselves if circumstances ever required it. Martin told me to keep every document, every email, every version of every report. He said when this landed, someone was going to claim they had not seen it coming, and I needed to be able to demonstrate that it had been there in writing for over 10 years. I thanked him and did not call anyone else. I put the folder on my desk in plain sight and I waited. Because I knew Preston would keep going. I knew he would keep pushing. And I knew that eventually he would do something in front of enough witnesses that there would be no walking it back. The bonus announcement was that moment. He had made his final mistake in front of the entire operations floor, on the best quarter in company history, after canceling recognition for people who had given him results no one had ever achieved before. I gave him 5 minutes to settle into the conference room and believe this was going to be a complaint he could dismiss. Then I walked in and sat down across from him. Preston leaned back in his chair and crossed one leg over the other. He had the expression of a man who has delivered a difficult but necessary decision and is now prepared to explain it to someone less strategically minded.
"Wesley," he said, "I understand people have feelings about the bonus announcement.
But leadership sometimes requires making choices that prioritize long-term organizational health over short-term morale. What we accomplished this quarter becomes the foundation for." "Pull up the Q3 performance metrics," I said. He stopped. "What?" "The numbers. Pull them up." He looked at me for a moment, the way people look at someone who has interrupted a prepared speech, caught between irritation and the instinct to appear cooperative. Then he turned to his laptop and clicked through until Calvin's report filled the screen. 285.3% over forecast. "Now open the current org chart," I said. He did. I slid the folder across the table. "Open it." Preston looked at the folder the way you look at something you have been handed but did not ask for. He opened it without urgency, glanced at the first page, then stopped. His eyes moved across the highlighted clause. He read it again. The specific sentence, the threshold, the trigger language, the date, and the 2 signatures at the bottom. "This is old contract language," he said. His voice had changed, just slightly. The easy confidence had thinned around the edges. "Nobody enforces clauses like this. It has been sitting in a file for 10 years. "It has been sitting in a file for 11 years, I said. "And it was enforceable on the day it was written. Legal confirmed that this week. The threshold was 250%. We closed Q3 at 285.3. Preston closed the folder. "This is not how senior leadership decisions work." "The board may want to weigh in on that," I said. "I have already sent them a summary." The color did not leave his face dramatically. It went gradually, in the way that happens when someone realizes the situation is not what they believed it to be, and the realization is too large to process quickly. He did not say anything else. I stood and walked out to find Calvin, because there was a board meeting to prepare for. The call was scheduled for 10 the next morning. Department heads filed into the main conference room with the particular quietness that fills a room when people understand that something significant is about to happen and are uncertain which direction it will land. Sarah from marketing sat near the back wall. Calvin placed his laptop open on the table, but did not type. Logan from IT arrived earlier than usual, which told me the story had already moved through the building faster than the official communication had. Preston was already seated when I walked in. He had recovered some of his composure overnight, or at least the exterior version of it. He sat with his laptop open and his posture straight and his expression arranged into something that suggested calm confidence. I recognized it as the same performance he had given in Dearborn, and I had already seen how that ended. Howard Walsh appeared on the main screen at 10 o'clock exactly. He looked smaller than the last time I had seen him in person. The oxygen tube was visible now, and his face had the particular tiredness that comes from fighting something that does not respond to effort. But his eyes were the same, precise, attentive, the eyes of a man who had built something real and knew the difference between substance and theater. I stood, picked up the remote, and clicked to the first slide. Q3 performance, I said, 285.3% over forecast, $6 million in verified operational savings. The Ford Motor Company contract, signed and currently in active delivery. I clicked to the next slide. My 2014 employment agreement, the relevant page, the highlighted clause, the threshold, the signatures. This clause was activated the moment Q3 closed, I said. Legal has reviewed and confirmed enforceability. I am formally invoking it now. The room was quiet enough that I could hear the ventilation system in the ceiling. Howard looked at the clause on the screen for a long moment. Preston leaned forward. Uncle Howard, with respect, this kind of contract language was never intended to be used in a situation like this. It was a retention incentive, written over a decade ago, under completely different circumstances. Applying it now would be. I remember this clause, Howard said. Preston stopped. I insisted on it myself, Howard said. I remember the specific meeting. Martin Hale drafted it, and I read every word before it was signed. Preston looked at his uncle with an expression I recognized as the early stage of genuine panic, carefully held under the surface. This is operational politics, Preston said. His voice had lost its measured quality. This is a department head trying to grab authority because he disagrees with strategic direction. Howard looked at his nephew for a moment. Stop talking, he said. 2 words, quiet and final. The way a door closes when someone has made a decision and is no longer interested in the argument. Then Howard looked at me. Wesley, what are you requesting? Full operational authority for Q4, I said. Personnel restoration. Budget oversight, return to operations. Strategic planning authority for the production floor. No interference from people who do not have manufacturing experience. Preston shook his head. This is a power grab. This is exactly the kind of move that. Preston. Howard's voice was not loud. It did not need to be. I said stop talking. He looked back at me. Approved. Preston looked at his uncle like he had misheard the word. Approved? He repeated. Howard's expression did not change. Pack your office. Security will be there in 20 minutes. There was no shouting, no dramatic collapse. Preston simply sat there for a moment while the words settled into the room and everyone around the table very carefully did not react. Then he stood, gathered his laptop, his leather notebook, and the imported water bottle he carried like a credential, and walked to the door. He stopped once and looked back at me. I do not know what he expected to see. Triumph, maybe. Some version of the vindication he had assumed I was after. I gave him nothing. No expression, no speech, no performance of any kind. Just a steady, neutral look from someone who had done what needed to be done. He walked out, and the room quietly exhaled. The first thing I did after the call ended was send 2 text messages. The first went to Nicole Reed. It said, "Come back, your desk is waiting." Her reply came in under 3 minutes. Finally. The second went to Bryce Miller. It said, "Operations needs its data analyst. Interested?" His response was shorter. "On my way." I leaned back in my chair and let out a breath I had been holding, it felt like, for 6 months. We were not celebrating yet. The floor was still running on systems Preston's consultants had complicated. The reporting structure was tangled. 2 key supplier relationships had gone quiet during the disruption and would need to be rebuilt through direct conversation. There was real work ahead. But the rebuilding had a team again. Nicole and Bryce walked back through the lobby the following morning with the efficiency of people returning to a job they had never stopped caring about. There were no speeches, no formal welcome. Nicole stopped at her old desk, put her hand flat on the surface for exactly 1 second, and looked at me. "Tell me where the damage is worst," she said. I pointed at the production reports from the previous 6 weeks. She sat down and started reading. Bryce was already at his workstation, pulling apart the dashboard systems Preston's consultants had built over hours and identifying what could be salvaged and what needed to be rebuilt from the ground up. By the end of the first day, the real numbers were back on the screens. Uptime, output, defect rates, supplier lead times. The honest, unglamorous data that tells you whether an operation is healthy or performing for an audience. Within the week, Preston's 2 most visible appointments had quietly disappeared. Hunter Kane, the culture expert with a podcast, and the extremely confident opinions about manufacturing psychology, submitted a resignation letter that used the phrase "pursuing other opportunities" 3 times in 2 paragraphs. Mason Ford, the thought architect, simply stopped showing up. His badge was deactivated on a Wednesday. Nobody mentioned it. The floor felt different. Not loudly different, but the particular tension that had settled over the building in March, that low-grade unease that comes when people who understand the work are answerable to people who do not, that tension was gone. 3 weeks after Preston left, Howard called me for a private conversation. Atlantic Manufacturing Solutions had approached the company about a potential merger. They had automation technology we did not have, specifically robotic integration systems that would improve our throughput significantly on high-volume runs. What they did not have was production discipline. Their quality numbers were inconsistent. Their floor management was reactive rather than systematic. They were good engineers building good machines, but struggling to operate them at scale. Their CEO, a man named Parker Stevens, had one specific condition for moving forward. Wesley's team oversees integration, no outside management firm, no transition committee, no consultants. Howard said it without commentary, just presented it to me the way he always presented things he had already decided were reasonable. I thought about the 6 months I had spent watching competent people get sidelined by people who had never run a production floor. I thought about Nicole and Bryce and the rest of the team who had delivered 285% and received nothing but a higher target. "Let's build it the right way," I said. The merger was completed in 31 days. No chaos, no restructuring theater, no consultants arriving with binders and frameworks and enormous invoices. Two companies combining what they each actually did well, with clear accountability for who was responsible for what. 6 months later, the numbers were simple and honest. Combined operation running at 97% efficiency. Q4 tracking 22% ahead of projection. The Ford partnership had expanded into a 5-year strategic alliance. Not because of a pivot, not because of a rebrand, because competent people were running competent operations, and the results reflected that. Nicole was training 3 new analysts. Bryce's systems were so clean that Howard told me in a call that he could read the weekly report before his second cup of coffee and actually understand what it said, which he called the clearest sign of progress. For the first time in a long time, the company felt like it was being led rather than performed at. Then, one afternoon in November, LinkedIn sent me a notification. Preston Walsh had launched a consulting firm. The name was exactly what you would expect: Innovation Catalyst Solutions. The profile described his work as transformational strategic advisory for manufacturing organizations seeking to evolve their operational culture. The language was fluent and empty in the way he had always been fluent and empty. I read the page once, then I closed the laptop and walked out to the floor. The machines were running at full capacity. The team was moving with purpose. Nicole was correcting a new analyst's report in red pen with the focused patience of someone who has high standards and is willing to take the time to transfer them. Bryce's dashboards were clean and honest and impossible to hide a problem behind. The floor was loud with the sound of actual work. That was Preston's consequence. Not a scandal, not a public collapse, not a moment of visible humiliation. He had chased authority without earning trust, and now he was selling empty language to people who had not yet learned to be skeptical of it. Meanwhile, the team he had dismissed had built something that would outlast his memory of the place. And honestly, that was exactly enough. I have been asked since then whether I felt satisfaction when the clause activated, whether watching Preston walk out of the building felt like the moment I had been working toward. The honest answer is no, not exactly. What I felt was relief. The relief of a situation resolved cleanly, without public theater, with the right people returned to the right positions. The relief of a floor running the way a floor should run, with people who understood it in charge of it. People imagine revenge has to be loud to be real. They picture confrontations and speeches and a perfect final moment where the person who wronged you sees the cost of what they did and registers the full weight of it. But most of the time, that is not how it works. Sometimes the machine running at 97% is the revenge. Sometimes the team that came back and fixed the damage is the revenge. Sometimes a footnote in a contract, dated and witnessed and quietly waiting for 11 years, does more than any confrontation ever could. Preston knew how to perform authority. I knew how to build something that performed in reality. In the end, results did what anger never could. They told the truth, quietly and without any help from either of us. I still walk the floor every afternoon. Old habit, but an honest one. You learn more in 20 minutes on the floor than in 2 hours reading reports about the floor. The machines tell you things. The team tells you things, not in words, but in how they move, how they communicate, whether they look like people who trust the environment they are working in. The afternoon I understood this particular story was finished, I walked the length of the floor and everything looked right. Every station running. Every indicator where it should be. Nicole in a corner with her red pen. Bryce at his desk with his honest numbers on his honest screens. Howard Walsh had called that clause an insurance policy. He had said it was there for when someone forgot who actually kept the operation alive. He was right, and the policy had paid out exactly when it was supposed to. If this story stayed with you, I would genuinely like to know what you think. Would you have stayed quiet and gathered your evidence the way Wesley did? Or would you have confronted Preston earlier? Tell me in the comments. And if you believe quiet competence always tells the truth eventually, subscribe to the channel. There are more stories here about the kind of people who hold the line and what happens when their patience finally runs out.